Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. All right, man. So as you know, the Astros are in the World Series right now. I need to get me another hat for them being in the World Series. Hopefully, I can get another one for them winning the World Series. They gotta do a heck of a comeback job. But as you guys do know, we have the Grand Swiss FIDE. So I do have the Fabiano Caruana game versus David Howell. It got into a very interesting Endgame. So I'm really kind of excited to show that. But yes, all my people in the Philippines, I will say my hi to you. Magandang hapon. I appreciate you guys very much. Maraming salamat. Aking makaibigan po sa nanonood ng aking mga video. I appreciate you guys very much. Mabuting pagbati ingat lagi. I appreciate it very much, everybody in the world that watches my stuff. But if you guys are ready to go, let's hit it. See what we got. All right, so we got E4, E5. Knight comes to F3, knight to C6, bishop to B5, knight to F6, and we do have G3. So we do have the Berlin defense of the Ruy Lopez, and Fabiano just decides to go ahead and just defend the pawn immediately with D3. Always, an option. You guys know you can castle as well. You don't have to worry about that E4 pawn. Bishop does come to C5. We see C3 just creating a lift for our bishop to kind of, hop back into at some point. We do got castles by black, castles by white, D6, bishop to G5. This is just giving yourself the ability to get this bishop out, so that, this knight coming to D2 can be after the bishop is already moved and you're not blocking it. So sometimes it can be more efficient, just depends. We do have H6. Bishop to H4, and then we do have G5. And this is highly committal, because, the king is somewhat opened. That's just the nature of the situation. It's definitely not horrible for black, but, it definitely gives white a little bit of an edge. We do see bishop down to G3. Knight comes to H5. David Howell just really doesn't like this bishop, so it's just he's just harassing the crap out of it. Knight B comes to D2. We see queen down to F6, bishop takes C6, pawn takes C6, and then we do have D4. And it might kind of seem like, wait a minute, if this pawn takes here, you take back, you're just losing a pawn, right? Well, the whole main point behind this is so that after pawn takes D4, you actually push E5 first. And then, of course, if the pawn takes, you got the bishop coming up here. Getting on this diagonal, and you are going to be taking back. You're just dealing with getting, tempi on the queen. So we do see queen back to G7, fianchettoing herself. And then we do have pawn taking D4. And we are actually good to go here. Bishop comes back to B6, and then we actually see the novelty of the game, which is A4. Very logical move. This is a very, common theme. You're hoping that black falls asleep and forgets that they like their pieces, and you can push A5 and trap the bishop. But David Howell is not going to do that. We do see A5. Knight comes to C4. We see bishop to E6. Asking white, what do you want to do with your knight? Do you want to trade it for one of my bishops? You want to swing a rook over and protect? And we do see rook over to C1. We're just going to go ahead and protect it. Knight takes G3, pawn takes G3, bishop takes C4, rook takes C4. And we have gotten to a very interesting part of the game. We see rook A to D8. We see the very accurate rook to E1. And then we see rook F to E8. And this is where things get really dicey. Pawn takes D6, rook takes E1 with check, queen takes E1. We see rook takes D6. And then we have actually reached the point in the game. If you don't want to pause the video, there is a tactic in the position right now for Fabiano Caruana. If you want to guess and see how he plays this, go ahead and do so. Okay, bam. All right, man. So there is actually a way to win a pawn in this position. So you might be sitting there thinking, wait a minute, how do you win a pawn? Because, all these pawns everywhere are defended, right? Wrong. You can actually sacrifice your rook to win a pawn. So if you guessed, rook takes C6, exclaim. It's not like the greatest move in the history of the world, but it does win a pawn. So after the rook takes C6, you actually have queen to E8 with check, picking up the rook and a pawn. and the king sidestepping over to h7, and then you have queen taking c6. And as you can see, there is 6 pawns to 5, and white is just good a pawn. Now, going back to actually after rook takes c4, the way that you kind of remedy the situation and not lose a pawn is actually immediately going c5. And this keeps everything like really equal. You know, white would be playing rook to e1. And it basically just gets rid of the pawn being undefended on c6. And so that was something, you know, that you had the ability to do. And then, you know, you can always trade here, stuff like that. And, you know, you're not giving white a pawn. But like I said, we did not see that. We get into this position here, and then we see all of this here. And you do kind of have to be careful as black. You can't just think, oh man, wait a minute. Okay, let me just do the math. Like, wait a minute. Okay, so that's double attacked, that's single defended, because there is actually a really nice way to win a piece if you fall into that sense of security. So if you say, man, I'm gonna get the pawn, bishop takes d4, right? Okay, you actually see queen to e4 with check, and now your bishop is hanging. And this is 1000% winning for white. So you definitely don't want to fall into this. You have to be very careful when you have your king exposed and you have a queen on the board. There are a lot of tactics involved. So like I said, after this position, we actually see David Howell play a much better move, and that is queen to g6, offering a trade, which, you know, would actually not be bad. But Fabiano says, hey, man, I don't want to trade. So he goes queen to d7, just avoiding the trade. Like I said, I mean, you know, you could have traded. I mean, it's not like it gives, you know, white the best position ever. So, you know, it's kind of either or situation. The king sidesteps over to g7. We see knight up to e5. And this is getting a nice tempo on the queen. So we do see queen to e6. Queen takes e6, pawn takes e6. And so what you get as white is you do get a less than desirable pawn structure, because you had to be thinking, even though you are up a pawn, the situation is, you know, your pawn structure isn't looking the best in this particular spot, and you do have an isolated pawn. So the benefit of going queen to e6 and trading is now you kind of gave black, you know, a pawn structure that's not super favorable. So, you know, you're kind of getting a little something. So knight does come to c4. And this is, you know, trying to ask black what it wants to do. And so we actually see king coming up to f6. And, you know, some of you guys might be wondering, okay, I mean, is it possible to take this pawn right here? It is, but you do desert your pawn on a5. So, you know, you kind of get your stuff back. And then, I mean, if you see bishop going here, the knight is coming down, and you do now have a passed pawn. And it is a little bit faster than this pawn. So, you know, you got to be really kind of careful when you're making certain moves. So we did see the king going to f6. Knight took on b6, and then you see pawn taking on b6. And then you have the very accurate, nice in-game move, g4. And so after we see e5, pawn takes e5, king takes e5, we do see the super accurate g3. And we are just trying to keep this king, you know, away from our pawns, because, you know, this one is a little bit weak. So these pawns are actually like protecting each other, even though they are doubled. And so one of the main things I wanted to talk to you guys about, you know, as far as this position goes, is something I literally talked about at the very beginning of my YouTube. And it is, you know, what is called like a pawn freeze. If you notice something about the structure that is here, not only does white have an extra pawn, but they are using a minority of their pawns to greatly restrict black's pawns. So as you notice, this one pawn is in the perfect position to restrict both of these pawns. And it is the same thing over here. It is a technique that is used in endgames just to restrict the movement of your opponent's pieces, because it is really hard to push this pawn without just basically giving it away. Because the king is not able to be on both sides of the board. So it's going to be, you know, out of favor for black to be doing that, because then their king is going to have to run over on one side of the board. And what I will do is up in the top corner, I will put the card for the video of what the type of concept I'm talking about. I'll talk about it more in depth. But anyways, going a little bit further, we do see king to d4. And like I said, the problem with this particular endgame is the fact that you have pawns on different sides of the board. And when you have a king and pawn endgame, it is very hard to win these types of positions where you have pawns on complete opposite sides of the board, because the king can only move one square at a time. So we do see f4 played by white, and then the king goes back to d5, and it is in this position that David Howell does resign the game, and he is definitely good enough to understand that this is a completely losing endgame, and also he is playing formerly the world #2. I think he dropped to like 3 or 4 during this tournament or something like that, but he is still top in the world in the game. And this is just not something, I mean, even a computer couldn't win this against another computer. So, you know, it is just not something to do. What white is going to be doing in this position is they're going to be pushing f5, or, you know, or they can possibly go king to g2. They're about the same. And, you know, black is basically just in a Zugzwang. I mean, what do? You definitely can't trade here because you're just going to be helping white's pawn structure, and the king is in a good position. You can't really start going in the direction of these pawns over here, because this pawn is going to be pushing forward. Like I said, you're going to probably go, if you don't go king to g2, you're going to go f5. And you know, the problem is, you know, black really has to stay in connection with this square. And that is also another concept that I've talked about, being in the square of the pawn in endgames. I'll put that card up here as well. You know, so there are a lot of different concepts that are being hit, just basic elementary, you know, concepts that are being hit, but that's basically what wins games. So that is that game. You know, so it got a little bit deep, but this is definitely an endgame that FIDE, you know, most average, you know, intermediate to, you know, master level players can win this type of position in their sleep. So it is no contest. So I appreciate everybody very much for stopping by. Maraming salamat, aking makaibigan, and I will see everybody next time.